Yeah. Hi guys, good evening. What we discussed in the last session? Yeah. In the last session, we discussed what is Lombok. I'm sharing my screen. Is my screen visible? Is my screen visible for everyone? Online students. Online people? Yes, good. Fine. In the last session, we discussed what is Lombok and why we need to go for Lombok and how to work with Lombok. So today we are starting our discussion related to Spring Boot. We understood what is a Spring and what is IOC container, what is dependency injection. Today it is our first session related to Spring Boot. First, what is this Spring Boot? Guys, Spring Boot is not a separate framework. It is not a separate framework. Spring Boot is one approach. Spring Boot is one approach to develop Spring-based applications with less configurations. We can develop a project by using Spring Framework. If we develop project by using Spring Framework, we need to take care of lot of configurations. We need to write the XML file, or we need to write the configuration class. We need to represent the class as Spring Bean. We need to start IOC container. Lot of stuff we need to do on our own. So to overcome the configuration problems, Spring people provided Spring Boot. So what is Spring Boot? Spring Boot is one approach to develop Spring-based applications with minimal and or less configurations. What type of applications we can do by using Spring? Same type of applications can be done by using Spring Boot. Using Spring Boot, we can develop below types of applications. Okay, using Spring Boot, we can develop below types of applications. You can create standalone application by using Spring Boot, and you can create web application also by using Spring Boot, and you can create distributed applications by using Spring Boot, nothing but web services. If one application wants to communicate with another web application, then we will go for web services. Those web services is called as distributed applications. Using Spring Boot, we can develop below types of applications. One is standalone application, second one is web application, and the third one is distributed application. So Spring Boot is one approach to develop Spring-based applications with less configurations. Whatever you do by using Spring, same thing can be done by Spring Boot. Sir, then when the Spring is already available, why we are going for Spring Boot? Why we are going for Spring Boot? In the Spring, programmer need to take care of configurations, whereas in the Spring Boot, we no need to take care of that configurations. Advantages of Spring Boot. We have below advantages with the Spring Boot. We have below advantages with the Spring Boot. The first one is, the first advantage with the Spring Boot, that is starter POM. The first advantage with the Spring Boot is starter POM. We are creating projects and we are adding dependencies in the projects. So now when we are adding dependencies, there is a chance of using multiple dependencies in the pom.xml. But what this Spring Boot has done is, Spring Boot provided a concept called starter POM. It will reduce your Maven configuration and Gradle configurations. I want to develop a web application. To develop a web application, Spring Boot provided Web Starter. Spring Boot provided Web Starter. By using one Web Starter, you can develop Spring Boot application, web application. If you add one Web Starter, Spring Boot will provide all the required dependencies to develop the web application. So the starter Poms are available. What is the purpose of this? Simplifies Maven configuration. Simplifies Maven or Gradle configurations. Gradle build configurations. If you add one dependency, Spring Boot will take care of all the required dependencies to develop and run our application. What are the examples available in the starter Pom? To develop a web application, it provided a starter called Web Starter. If you want to develop persistence logic, it provided one starter called Data JPA Starter. If you want to develop security for your project, they provided Security Starter. They provided Security Starter. And similarly, they provided Mail Starter. I want to send email from my boot application. Whatever the configuration that is required for sending the email, that will be taken care by Mail Starter. Whatever the configuration that is required to develop security in the project, that will be taken care by Security Starter. How to communicate with the database, that will be taken care by JPA Starter. How to develop web application will be taken care by Web Starter. So like this, we have several advantages with the Spring Boot. What is the first advantage with the Spring Boot? Starter Pom. What is the advantage with the starter Pom? It will simplify our Maven or Gradle build configuration. If you add this web starter, you can develop a web application. You don't need to do any other configurations. You don't need to do any other settings here. You just add the web starter, then Spring Boot will provide the support to develop web application and distributed applications. So similarly, the second advantage in the Spring Boot, that is auto configuration. The second advantage is auto configuration. What is auto configuration? In every project, some common configurations will be available. So specify configuration class, perform component scanning, create IOC container, deploy the project into server. So these are my project specific requirements. These are universal requirements. These are universal requirements. Now here, whatever common configuration is required for the project, that will be taken care by Spring Boot. That is called auto configuration. So in the auto configuration, here creating DB connection pool. Whenever we add JPA starter, it will create the database connection pool for you. Based on your starter, the Spring Boot will understand what configuration is required for your project. Here we can say Spring Boot is intelligent to understand what configuration is required for your project. Whenever we add JPA starter, why you will add JPA starter? If you want to connect with the database, then you will add the JPA starter. If you add the JPA starter, Spring Boot will think that this person wants to communicate with the database. Let me load the driver. Let me create the connection. Let me set up the connection pool also. If you add one starter in the pom.xml, this Spring Boot will create the database connection pool. Suppose if you add web starter, when you will add a web starter? When you will add a web starter? When you want to develop a web application, right? For every web application, server is required. When you add web starter, Spring Boot will think that this person developing a web application, to run the web application, he needs a server. Spring Boot will provide the server for you. You no need to download and install the server. Whenever you add web starter, Spring Boot will provide deploy web application in server. Deploy web application in server. Deploy web app in embedded server. Automatically, server also will come in the Spring Boot and it will deploy your project in the server. Similarly, you will add security starter. When you will go for security starter? if you want to perform some security for your application, if you add security starter, by default your application will be secure. Whatever the configuration is required to secure our application, that will be provided by Spring Boot. That means now whatever the configuration that is required for Spring Boot application, whatever the configuration that is required for your project, that configuration will come automatically if you create the project by using Spring Boot. Now start the IOC container. Starting the IOC container is everybody requirement. In the Spring application, we are starting the IOC container. But in the Spring Boot, we no need to start the IOC container. It will start automatically by Spring Boot. And in the Spring, we have specified component scanning. Hey, configuration class, you perform the component scanning. We are creating one configuration class and we are specifying to perform the component scanning. In the Spring Boot, component scanning is inbuilt functionality. In the Spring Boot component scanning, inbuilt functionality. You just to run your project, IOC container will start, component scanning will happen, objects will be created, dependency injection will happen, connection pool will be created, application will be deployed into server also automatically. That concept is called as auto configuration. It will identify which configuration is required for our project based on the starters we are adding in the pom.xml. If I add web starter, then I will get the server. Okay. If I add JPA starter, I will get the connection pool. If I add security starter, it will secure my application. If I add mail starter, I can send emails from our application. So manual configuration, auto configuration. What is the meaning of manual configuration? Programmer has to specify everything either by using XML file or by using annotation. That is we followed in the Spring. But the Spring Boot is an extension for the Spring. Once the Spring is used in the market, Spring people realized everybody doing some common configurations. Why can't we automate those configurations? That's where Spring Boot came up with a concept called auto configuration. Can you tell me what is the Spring Boot? Can you tell me what is Spring Boot, guys? Spring Boot is one approach to develop Spring-based applications with less configurations. Can I say Spring Boot is a replacement for the Spring? Spring Boot is not replacement for the Spring. Then what is the Spring Boot? Spring Boot is extension for the Spring framework. So what type of applications we can develop by using Spring Boot? Whatever you can do by using Spring, whatever you can do by using Spring, same thing you can do by using Spring Boot also. IOC, dependency injection, everything. Every Spring concept can be used in the Spring Boot also. Boot is not separate framework. Boot is the extension for the Spring only. Now there are several advantages with the Spring Boot. What is the first advantage? Starter Pom. What is the second advantage? Auto configuration. Can you tell me what is the starter Pom? Starter Pom, nothing but it will simplify our Maven or Gradle configurations. So by adding less number of dependencies, we can manage our project. In the Spring, we have to configure a lot of dependencies, but in the Spring Boot, the dependencies are simplified when you go for starter Pom. And what is the second advantage? Auto configuration. What is the meaning of auto configuration? Boot will identify required configs for our application. What are the configurations that are required for the project? That will be identified by Spring Boot only. For every Spring application, component scanning is required. For every Spring application, IOC container should be started. Every web application should be deployed to the server. For every application, connection pool is required. For every application, security is required. So these kind of common configurations will be identified by SpringBoot and it will provide those configurations for our project. That is called auto configuration concept. Auto configuration is one of the biggest advantage for using SpringBoot. Why SpringBoot became that much popular in the market? The reason is auto configuration. Some common configurations required for several projects will be taken care by SpringBoot. We can develop our applications very easily by using SpringBoot. Are you getting my point? Now, let me show you the demo on these two concepts. First one is starter POM. Second one is auto configuration. Let us see. Don't expect you will understand everything today. I just want to show you how starter POM will look like and how auto configuration will happen. Now I am going for file, new. I'm creating a project called Spring Starter Project. So here I'm giving my project name as 09 SpringBoot First App. 09 SpringBoot First App. You can go for Gradle or Maven as a build tool. I'm going for Maven, Java 11. Packaging type, you can use jar or var. Group ID, what is group ID? Organization name. Ashok IT is the group ID. Package name, whatever the package name we are using, this package name is called base package name. This is called base package. Click on next. Here it is asking which version of the SpringBoot you want to use. Let me go with 2.7. What is the latest version? 3.x. Right. I'm going with 2.7 version of the SpringBoot. Here there are several dependencies are available. These are called starter POMs. Which dependency you want to use for your project? I want to develop one web application. Let me type web here. Let me type web. What is the dependency I have? Spring Web is available. Can you see this? Build web RESTful applications using Spring MVC. Whenever you use web starter, you can create web applications as well as RESTful applications with the MVC architecture by using Spring Web MVC module. When I use a web starter, internally boot is using Spring Web MVC module. Now select Spring Web dependency and it is providing what? Apache Tomcat. Do I need to download and install the server? Not required. It will be provided by SpringBoot. I'm creating the boot application by adding web starter. Click on next, click on finish. That's it. My SpringBoot application is getting created. My SpringBoot application is created. It is downloading the required dependencies. First time I'm creating the boot application. What are the dependencies are required for that? It is downloading from the central repository. First time I'm creating boot application. I selected boot 2.7 version. What is the latest version of the boot? 3.0. I'm using 2.7. Now fine. My SpringBoot application is created by using Java 11. My boot application got created, guys, by using Java 11. Can you see somewhere we have seen this folder structure? What is that folder structure? Maven. We used Maven as a build tool to create the boot application. Go to pom.xml. Somewhere we have seen parent, Maven multi-module project. Child projects will be available. Parent project will be available. By default, SpringBoot starter parent will come as a parent for our project. And here we have a dependency. Can you see what is this dependency? SpringBoot starter web. SpringBoot starter web dependency. This is called POM starter. This is called POM starter. Earlier, for dependencies, we need to specify group ID, artifact ID, version. Now, am I specifying version for the dependency? No, version will be taken care by parent starter. I configured parent starter with 2.7.10. Same version will be applicable for my starters in the project. Version management also will be taken care by Spring Boot. So I created a project. At the time of a project creation, I added web starter. Okay. Now go here. Now let me simply run this project. I'm not writing any classes. Just run as Spring Boot application. Now go to console. Go to console. What is this? What it is saying, guys? It is saying that Tomcat is started. So it is saying that Tomcat is started. Am I starting the Tomcat? My Spring Boot is starting the Tomcat. Spring Boot is starting the Tomcat. In advanced Java, we have taken 2 days to understand a Tomcat setup. But is it required now? Not required. Why? Auto configuration. That is the auto configuration. Why Tomcat server is coming? Why Tomcat server is coming? Because I have added web starter. If I add the web starter, Boot is thinking that this person developing a web application, for web application, server is required. For web application, server is required. Now, here guys, let me do one small change. In this project, if you see, one class will be created by default. This class is called start class of the Spring Boot. We'll understand what is this start class. Okay. I will make some small change here at the rate rest controller annotation I am writing. I will write one method public string welcome. Public string welcome. I'm returning simple welcome to Ashok IT. Okay. Yes. Let me go for @get mapping. Right. I'm developing one REST API. Okay. So I have developed one Spring Boot application. In the Spring Boot application, I added one method. What is that method? It is not required to understand now. Just see how auto configuration is working. Now let me run this project again. Run as boot application. I'm running my boot application. Application started. It is deployed in the Tomcat server also. Let me go to browser. Let me type the URL and let me access my project. Localhost :8080. Localhost :8080. Am I able to access my application? How much time it is taking to develop a web application? Fraction of seconds. I just created a project and I created my method. I am executing my application. My application is a web application. It is deployed in the Tomcat server and I am able to access my application in the browser also. Suppose if I want to do this in the servlets, we need to create a project. We need to add the jar, multiple dependencies we need to configure. We need to map the servlet to the URL pattern and we need to override the doGet method, doPost method, add the Tomcat, install the Tomcat server, package the project as a WAR file, deploy that WAR file to the Tomcat server. But here, development time is reduced or not? Development time is reduced or not? Tomcat server is coming automatically because of my web starter. Now I want to secure my application. I want to secure my application. Here, I'm able to send the request. I'm getting the response from my application. I'm sending the request to the URL. I'm getting the response from my application. In order to secure this application, I will add one dependency, Spring Boot starter security. I will add one starter, Spring Boot starter security. Are you guys clear with what I am doing here? I'm adding just one starter called security starter. Right click and clear this. Right click, Maven update project. What is the meaning of a Maven update? Download the required dependencies. Right click, run as boot application. Right click, run as boot application. For my application, it generated a password. For my application, it generated a password. Now, go and access our application. What happened? What happened? my application is secured. Am I writing any logic here? I'm just adding one dependency. When I add one dependency, Spring Boot is understanding my requirement and it is providing that configuration for us. Now, if anybody want to access my application, they need to log in. Did I develop this login page? Who is providing this login page? Spring Boot is providing this login page. When the Spring Boot is providing this login page for me? When I add one dependency called security starter. When I add one dependency called Spring Boot starter security, by default, my application is authenticated. By default, my application is authenticated. Sir, how to verify the username and password is valid or not? Simple, you need to do here. What username password you want to use to allow your people to log in, you can configure spring.security.user.name. I will specify Ashok IT. Spring.security.user.password. User.password is equal to Ashok IT @123. That's it. If user use these credentials, then only it will allow to access my method. Otherwise, it will not allow to access my method. Like this, we can decide credentials for authenticating the users. Now, let me stop my application. I stopped my application. Guys, observe. Did I write any code here for securing my application? For validating the credentials? Am I writing any classes here? Nothing I'm doing. I just created a project. By default, I got one class. That is called start class. Now, let me run this application. Run as boot application. My application started. Now go to browser. Let me access localhost :8080. It is asking to sign in. Enter some dummy credentials. Click on sign in. It is validating the given username and password also. Am I writing the logic to validate the credentials? Who is doing that? Spring Boot is doing that. Now let me give valid credentials. I'm giving valid credentials. Sign in. Now I'm able to get welcome to Ashok IT. Am I writing any code to secure my project? No, that is provided by Spring Boot. What configuration I have done? Just I added one starter. Just I added one starter in the Pom.xml, that is Spring Boot starter secure. This is very basic security that is providing by Spring Boot. You can improve that security by customizing our application. That we will discuss in the Spring security concept. Now here I'm using web starter. So what is the meaning of this web starter? It is providing all the support, all the configuration to run our web application. Now tell me, Spring is recommended, Spring Boot is recommended. Spring Boot is recommended. Why? Auto configuration. The main advantage of Spring Boot is auto configuration. The main advantage with the Spring Boot is auto configuration. What is a starter Pom? What is auto configuration? Starter Poms are used to simplify our Maven configuration. You no need to add hundreds of dependencies in the Pom.xml. You just add one dependency, Boot will take care of all the configurations. If you want to develop a web application, add the web starter. If you want to configure connection pool, add the JPA starter. If you want to configure security, add the security starter. If you want to send emails from your application, then add the mail starter. So starter Poms are going to simplify Maven and Gradle build configurations in the project. So can you tell me some of the starter Poms you have used in the project? Web starter, JPA starter, security starter, and mail starter. Are you guys getting my point? Next one, auto configuration. What is the meaning of auto configuration? What is the meaning of auto configuration? Boot will identify required configurations for our application, creating database connection pool, deploying web application in the embedded server, starting the IOC container, component scanning. Now see here, one more thing earlier, I will create one Java class. I will create one Java class. Let me keep in the beans package. Let me create it as a report service. Report service. How to represent this class as a Spring Bean? What is the annotation? @service. To understand object is created or not, let me go for constructor. System.out.println constructor. Report service constructor. Who will create the object? IOC container. Who will identify Spring Beans in the project? Configuration class. But in this project, do I have any configuration class? Did I create any configuration class? Am I starting IOC container? No. Now see the behavior. Run as boot application. Run as boot application 1 minute. Already server running on the same port number. That's why it is failed. Okay. Here server is already running. Let me stop it. Okay. Right click on this. Run as boot application. Now go to this. Can you see here? Can you see here? Report service constructor is executed or not executed? Report service constructor is executed. What is the meaning of constructor is executed? Object is created. Who created the object? IOC container. Who started IOC container? SpringBoot. SpringBoot. Because in the Spring framework, application context is equal to new class path. Is it required to remember that? No, because we no need to start that. In the real time, we will never start IOC container programmatically. Because our projects will be developed by using SpringBoot. SpringBoot will provide auto configuration. Now you see, Tomcat server started with port number 8080. Root web application context. IOC container started. IOC container started. Component scanning also completed. How can I say component scanning is completed? Report service available in the different package. in.ashokit.beans package. My start class is available in the in.ashokit. Am I telling to perform the component scanning or it is doing the component scanning by default? It is doing the component scanning by default. Now, can I say auto configuration is there in the SpringBoot? What is the proof? Component scanning happened automatically. IOC container started automatically. Tomcat server started automatically. Security provided automatically. Everything is happening in the SpringBoot just with a starter in the pom.xml. Now, how much time it will take to develop a web application and run the web application? Fraction of seconds. That is called rapid development. You can achieve rapid development of the projects by using SpringBoot because the biggest advantage in the SpringBoot is auto configuration. How SpringBoot is providing the configuration required for the project? Based on the starters. Whatever, suppose if I don't add security starter in the pom.xml, it will not provide the security. If I don't add the web starter, it will not provide the Tomcat. So auto configuration is working based on the dependencies we are adding in the pom.xml. Can I say boot is intelligent now? Yes, based on the pom.xml, it is understanding what configuration is required for our project and it is providing that configuration. What is the SpringBoot now? What is SpringBoot now? SpringBoot is the one of the approach. SpringBoot is one of the approach to develop Spring-based applications with less configurations. Already Spring framework is available. On top of the Spring framework, SpringBoot developed. SpringBoot is internally using Spring only. IOC container is used. Component scanning is using. Spring Web MVC it is using. All the Spring concepts only, but they simplified programmer's life. SpringBoot reduced the work for the developers. Can I say like that? Spring Boot is automating the common configurations required for the project. What type of application you can develop by using Spring, same type of application you can develop by using Boot also, with more speed, with less configuration. Same project I can do by using Spring also. But in the Spring, auto configuration is not there. Servers will not come. You need to add everything manually, either through XML or through annotation. But in the Spring Boot, automated. So then now I hope you got the clarity why Spring Boot is having that much demand in the market. Now, can you tell me why Spring Boot is having that much demand in the market? Because of its auto configuration. Tell me, what is the definition for the Spring Boot? Spring Boot is one approach to develop Spring-based applications with less configuration. Using Spring Boot, we can develop below types of application: standalone, web application, and distributed. What are the advantages of the Spring Boot? Starter Pom. What is a starter Pom? It is going to simplify our Maven or Gradle build configurations. These are the some starters. Like this, there are hundreds of starters available in the Spring Boot. I have just given 4 starters. There are so you can see when I am creating the project, how many dependencies it is displaying. Those are called as starters. Now, auto configuration. Spring Boot will identify what configuration is required for the project. It will provide that configuration. What are some examples we have seen for auto configuration? Security is coming automatically. Component scanning is happening automatically. IOC container created automatically. Tomcat server also started automatically. In future, when I add the JPA starter, connection pool also will be created. When I add these database properties, connection pool also will be created. Auto configuration. And the next one, the next advantage with the Spring Boot is actuators. Spring Boot is providing a concept called actuators. So actuators to monitor and manage our application. When we run our application, we need to understand how many beans loaded, how many classes loaded by my application, how many classes loaded by IOC container, how many beans available in the project, how many beans loaded, then how many URL patterns are mapped, how many URL patterns are mapped in our application, what configuration properties loaded, what configuration properties loaded by my application, and what is health of the application. What is health of application? How much memory consumed by our application in the JVM? How much memory consumed by application in the how much memory consumed by our application in the JVM? We can do that by using heap dump. I can download the heap. I will understand what is the heap capacity, how much memory used by our application, how much memory is free in the JVM. We can understand that. And how many threads are running our application. I can perform thread dump also. How many threads created by our project, how many threads are running, how many threads are sleeping. We can understand threads details also by using a concept called thread dump. We can check heap details also by using heap dump. We can see what is the health of the application. That means our application is having the sufficient memory or not, all the components are active or not. We can check health of the application, what configuration properties loaded by our application, how many URL patterns are available in our application, how many beans loaded by our application, what are the last 10 requests came to our application. HTTP tracing also we can do. So what are the last 100 requests came to our application, I can access. That is called actuator in the Spring Boot. What is the purpose of actuators? Actuators are used to monitor and manage our application. So these are the three main advantages of going with the Spring Boot. And one more thing, I want to add Lombok in the project. We discussed Lombok. What is Lombok? What is Lombok? To avoid setters getters writing. Now in the normal Maven project, I'm specifying Lombok dependency along with the version. But when you go for Spring Boot, application, you don't need to add version for the Lombok. Just to go to pom.xml, then along with these dependencies, I want to add Lombok dependency. When you add the Lombok, remove the version. You just specify, I want Lombok. Now, go to our Maven dependencies in the boot application. Can you see here, Lombok is downloaded? Can you see here, Lombok is downloaded? Did I specify the version or it downloaded that by default? That is called dependency version management. Whenever we add a dependency, Spring Boot will check what is the latest version available for the dependency, which is compatible with the Spring Boot. That version it is going to download. When you add the Hibernate dependency, you don't need to specify which version of the Hibernate. Boot will identify which version of the Hibernate is compatible with the Spring Boot. It will download that version. That is called version management. Do you need to remember version for the dependencies now? If you develop by using Spring, you need to remember the versions. But when you go for Spring Boot, you need to remember only Spring Boot to parent version. What is the parent version? 2.7. What about the remaining versions? Boot will take care. Boot parent starter will take care of the child dependency versions. Version management will be taken care by Spring Boot. Read these 3 points. Online students, are you able to follow me? Spring Boot is one approach to develop a Spring application with less configuration. There are several advantages in the Spring Boot: starter Poms, auto configuration, actuators, and there is a concept called embedded servers. What is the meaning of embedded server? It provides server to run our boot application. You no need to configure server to deploy your web application. Boot is having embedded server. Whenever we add web starter, by default Apache Tomcat will come as embedded server. It is providing Apache Tomcat as a embedded server. Apache Tomcat, it is default. Whenever we add web starter, by default we will get Apache Tomcat as a embedded server. If you don't want Apache Tomcat, you can change it also. There is another server called Jetty. Jetty is also a web server to run Java web application, and another server is available, Netty. Jetty and Netty, like that, there are some web servers are available to run. But by default, which server is coming for us? By default, Apache Tomcat is coming as a default embedded server. We have a flexibility to change that server also. Now, currently, I'm running my application, Spring Boot application. I'm having web starter. Okay, when I run the project, Tomcat server is coming by default. If you want, we can change that. I want to change port number for the Tomcat. Do you know how to change port number for the Tomcat? Server.xml, we changed it. But now, is it our server or is it Spring Boot server? I will tell to Spring Boot, hey, you use server.port as 9090. That's it. If I specify server.port as 9090, that embedded Tomcat server will run on the 9090 port number. Let us see this. Run this application, Maven update project, force update. Okay. Right click, run as boot application. Go to the console. Go to the console. Now, can you see this? Tomcat server started on the which port number now? 9090. So where to specify the port number? In the properties file. In the properties file, I specified server.port as 9090. Then Tomcat server running on the 9090. How the Tomcat server is coming? Because of this web starter. Because of this web starter, we are getting the Tomcat. If you want to change from Tomcat to Jetty, there is a configuration that we will discuss in the coming classes, right? We can change from the Tomcat to Jetty and Netty also. Tell me, what is the embedded server in the Spring Boot? Embedded server means the server which is providing by the Spring Boot to run our application. Okay, these all are the advantages of going for Spring Boot. Now, creating Spring Boot application. Creating Spring Boot application. We can create Spring Boot application in two ways, guys. Okay, one is using initializer website. Using initializer website, which is start.spring.io, and second one STS or IntelliJ IDE. Eclipse also. Either you can use IDE. Basically, I can say by using IDE, we can create the project. In how many ways we can create the boot application? In two ways. What is the first approach? By using initializer website, and the second one is the IDE. So initializer website, which is start.spring.io. Take this URL, go to browser and open this. It opened Spring Initializer website. From here, we can create the Spring Boot application and we can download that application. See, what is the project you want to create? Maven project. Which language you want to use? Java. Spring Boot can be used with Kotlin and Groovy also. Kotlin and Groovy are also JVM based languages, right? Java, Kotlin, Groovy, these are JVM based. Now I want to go with Maven and Java. It is choosing the current version of the Spring Boot. Which one? 3.0. I want to go for 2.7. Group ID, you can give anything, something like this, com.tcs, artifact ID. I will give it as boot application. Okay. Package name, base package. I want to give it as com.tcs. Packaging jar or var jar. Java version 11. Here, what is the option? Dependencies. Click on add. Which dependency? I want Lombok. Select the Lombok. And I want to go for web starter. Select the web starter. I want to go for actuator. Let's type it. Security I want. Then Spring security. So like this, which dependencies you want for your project, you can select the dependencies from here only. I am using Spring Initializer website. I selected project as Maven, language as Java, boot version 2.7, and packaging type as jar. 3 dependencies I have selected. Lombok, web, security. If I don't add web starter, that will become standalone project. If I don't add web starter, it will become standalone project. If I want to develop a web application, then I will go for web starter. Once it is done, there is a button called generate button available below. When I click on generate button, one zip file is downloaded. Go to my downloads folder. Go to my downloads folder. What happened? Boot app got downloaded. Now extract this zip file. Extract this zip file. boot application is downloaded. My boot application is downloaded. src pom.xml.gitignore. What is .gitignore? Which files we don't want to commit, those we can configure in the git ignore. Now pom.xml src. This project I can import into my IDE. I created a project by using initializer website. I downloaded that project. Now I want to import that project into IDE. Do you know how to import the project? Yes. Take this project, go to IDE, go to IDE. In the IDE, there is option called file import. So this project is what type of project? Existing Maven project. Click on next, give the project directory. Now I'm able to locate the pom.xml. Click on finish. Now I'm able to get my boot application. Go to pom.xml. Here web starter, Lombok and test starter is available. Boot to parent starter is available. I can run this project also. I can run this project also. Right click, run as boot application. This project is running as a web application. Now with the Tomcat. With which Tomcat port number? 8080. Previous project having one Tomcat. This project is having one Tomcat. This Tomcat is the external Tomcat or internal Tomcat? Internal Tomcat. That is called embedded server. So we are able to create the project by using initializer website, and we are able to download and we are able to import. That is one option. And we have another option also. Who will create their download, extract, import? Instead of that, I want to create the project directly in my IDE. In the Spring Toolsuite IDE, there is an option called Spring Starter Project. When you click on the Spring Starter Project, what it is doing, guys? That means our IDE also will connect with the initializer website only to create the project. That's why to create the boot application, internet connection is mandatory. Are you guys getting my point? My Spring Toolsuite IDE connecting with the initializer website. Can I call it is a web service? One application is communicating with the another application. That is called a distributed application. Our IDE, when I use Spring Initializer website, file new Spring Starter project. When I use the Spring Starter project, what is happening? Internally, it is talking to start.spring.io. If internet is not available, can your IDE connect to that initializer website? No. Net connection is mandatory to create the project. Now, here you can give the name. I'm giving the name as a 10 SpringBoot application. Okay. Maven, jar, version, language, whatever settings you want, you can change here. Click on next. Here dependency. Previously, I selected web. It is giving the suggestion, frequently used dependency. Now, click on web dependency. Now, click on next. Now, see, when I click on the next, that is the full URL. Whatever the options I have selected, these options, it is adding as a query parameter. In the servlet, we understood query parameter. What is query parameter? Sending the request to the server with some parameters in the URL. Now, my IDE sending a request to this URL with the query parameters, whatever the options we have selected. If I type this URL in the browser, that project will be downloaded. Is it downloaded? That means it is preparing the URL to download our project. Click on finish. Instead of we are downloading, extracting, importing, we can directly create the project from the IDE. IDE created the project and it downloaded the project, and you can simply run this project. How can we do that? Run as boot application. Your application will execute. So how many ways we can create the boot project, guys? We can create the boot project in the two ways. One is by using initializer website, and the second one is by using IDE. Now, let's understand Spring Boot application folder structure. When I create the boot application, what is the folder structure we have? Yes. It is just a Maven project folder structure, guys. We are using Maven as a build tool to create the project. SRC main Java. What is the meaning of SRC main Java? We can keep the project source code. By default, Spring Boot provided one Java class that is called start class. Whenever we run the project, Spring Boot application will start from that class only. That is called start class. In that start class, main method will be available. So it's been 2 months or 3 months we have used main method. In the core Java, we use the main method. In the advanced Java, there is no main method. But in the Spring Boot, whether it is a standalone, whether it is a web application, whether it is a distributed application, main method is mandatory. Spring Boot application will start from main method. That main method will be available in the application.java. Application.java is called as entry point for boot application execution. That is also called as start class of the Spring Boot. That is called start class of the Spring Boot. Without that class, our boot application cannot run. Without that class, our boot application cannot run. That's why that is called start class in our application. And here we are having SRC main resources. What is the meaning of SRC main resources? Any configuration files that are required for the project, we can keep in the resources folder. By default, boot is giving one file. What is that file? Application.properties. Your database properties, your log properties, security credentials. Earlier, I configured my credentials. Where I have configured? In the application.properties file. That is the default file using by the Spring Boot. I want to configure my database credentials. Is it recommended to keep the credentials in the Java program? No. We need to keep the credentials in the properties file. When you keep the credentials in the properties file, Spring Boot will load those properties by default. Are you guys getting my point? And the next one, test Java folder is available. What is the purpose of test Java folder? Unit testing related code will be available in the test Java folder. We have one application test.java. What is application.test.java? Unit test class. By default one, JUnit class also will be created. What is Maven dependencies? Whatever the starter we have added, it will download the dependencies. It will keep in that folder. And we have target folder. What is the target? What is the target folder? Dart class files will be created in the target. And we have pom.xml. What is pom.xml? Yes, it is a Maven configuration file which is used to add the dependencies. Is there any extra folder structure or it is a Maven folder structure? It is a Maven folder structure. Boot is providing two things extra. One is start class. Another one is properties file. Static and templates are available. These are used to keep our web content, our images, HTML files, JavaScript files, CSS files. We can keep in the static folder and templates folder. When we are going to develop a web application with the user interface, we will create the JSP pages, HTML pages, JavaScript, CSS, all that stuff we can keep in the static and templates folder. Right. So how to create the boot application? How to create the boot application? Two ways. Now, can you tell me what is start class in the Spring Boot? Start class is the entry point for boot application. Start class is the entry point for boot application. Can I run the boot application without start class? No. Start class is mandatory to run the boot application. What is there in the start class? What is there in the start class? Can you see what is there in the start class? There is a main method. Main method is internally calling what? Run method. Main method is calling run method. Run method is the entry point for the boot application. Sir, what is the return type of the run method? IOC container object. Right? Am I starting the IOC container? Spring Boot is starting the IOC container. Spring Boot is starting the IOC container. I want to get the bean object from the IOC. Now, run method internally will create the IOC container, and run method will return configurable application context. What is the return type of that, guys? Configurable application context, right? So the return type of run method is configurable application context. You can store that in the context object. So in the interview, people will ask, who will create IOC container in the Spring Boot? Who will create that? Run method. We need to do postmortem on the run method to understand how it is creating the IOC container. I will do that postmortem. Okay? Let's go here. I got the context object. I want to get the bean. How to get the bean object from the IOC? Context dot get bean. There is a class called. In this project, I think there is no class. Let me create one class. New class. Let me take it as a car. Do you know how to represent this class as a Spring Bean? @component. @component. Now write the constructor. Why I am writing the constructor? To understand object creation. Car constructor. Now I want to get the object for the car. Car dot class. Okay. Let me store that into car variable. System dot out dot println c dot hash code. I want to run this. Now, is there any configuration class available in this project? No. I just created the project. I got the start class. I created a car class. I represented that as a Spring Bean. I have run method. That run method is returning configurable application context. So run method will do lot of things internally. It is going to perform lot of activities. We need to understand what is happening inside the run method. Finally, what run method is doing? Returning the object of the IOC container. Who is starting that IOC container? Run method. How it is creating, where it is creating, we will understand that. Now I got the object of the IOC. By using that, I am calling getBean method. What is the purpose of getBean method? What is the purpose of getBean method? To get the object of the bean. Right click, run as boot app. See the console. Car object is created or not? Yes. Are you able to get the hash code of the object? Am I writing any configuration class? Am I writing any component scanning? Am I starting IOC container? Who is doing that? Spring Boot run method is doing that. Able to follow me? Yes. Right. So with this, we are able to understand how to create our first Spring Boot application. Right. So can you tell me the definition for the Spring Boot? Can you tell me the definition for the Spring Boot? Spring Boot is one approach to develop Spring-based applications with less configuration. Using Spring Boot, we can develop several types of application. Whatever you can do by using Spring, same thing can be done by using Spring Boot also. What are the advantages of using Spring Boot? Starter form. It will simplify your Maven configuration as well as Gradle configuration. Based on the starters we are adding in the pom.xml, Boot will perform auto configuration. What is the meaning of auto configuration? Boot will identify required configurations for our project. It will provide those configurations and it will provide actuators. What is the meaning of actuators? They are used to monitor and manage our application. And next one, embedded server. What is the meaning of embedded server? It provides server to run our boot application. What is the default embedded server we are getting? Apache Tomcat. Whenever we add a web starter, by default Apache Tomcat will come as embedded. Can I change the embedded server? Yes. We have Jetty and Netty. I want to create boot application. How many ways? Two ways. One is by using initializer website or by using IDE. If I use IDE, is it creating the project directly or it is talking to the initializer website? IDE will internally connect with start.spring.io website to create Spring Boot application. Spring Boot application is called as Spring Starter project. Spring Boot application is called as Spring Starter project. In the Spring Boot application, by default, start class will be created. What is the purpose of start class? Start class is the entry point for boot application execution. In that start class, main method will be available. In that main method, run method will be available. Run method will perform lot of activities. IOC container will start by run method. What is the return type of the run method? What is the return type of the run method? Configurable application context. What is that configurable application context? A reference of the IOC container. By using that context, can I get the bean object? Yes, by using getBean method. Now, here, whatever the annotations we have learnt in the Spring, component, service, repository, scope, depends on, auto wiring, bean, qualifier, primary. Can I use all the annotations here also? Can I use all the annotations here also? Yes, Spring Boot internally using Spring only. So whatever the concept we have learnt in the Spring, every concept can be used in the Spring Boot also, but no XML. So final conclusion, if we want to give for the Spring Boot, what we need to do is Spring Boot is equal to Spring minus XML configurations plus auto configuration plus embedded server. Right. Spring will be there in the Spring Boot, but XML configuration will not be available. Sir, you have pom.xml now. People will ask that doubt. Is that XML for project Spring project or it for Maven project? Pom.xml and Spring, there is no relation here, guys. Okay. So we no need to create any XML configuration. Beans XML, configuring the bean tag, that XML configuration not supported by the Spring Boot. So we need to go for only annotation based configuration. Spring Boot means Spring framework minus XML configuration. Along with the Spring, auto configuration available, embedded servers are available, and what we have and what we are having, actuators also available. So this is the conclusion for the Spring Boot. Spring Boot is equal to Spring. All the modules of the Spring can be used in the Spring Boot also. Spring minus XML configuration plus auto configuration plus embedded servers plus actuators. That is called Spring Boot. We can achieve rapid development. What is the meaning of rapid development? Quickly we can create our projects and we can run our projects without bothering about connection pool, without bothering about security, without bothering about the server. We can run and we can create and we can run the project. Just like that, we can create and run the web applications by using Spring Boot. Because of its advantages, it is having lot of demand in the market. Got it? Yes. Any questions, anyone for today? In memory you can add in the Spring also. That is not separate advantage. So you can add that in memory database. Database also you no need to install. Boot will provide the database also to develop your application. How we are having embedded server. Similarly, you can go for embedded database also. In the Spring data JPA, we will go with that. Okay. Yes. Perfect. Good. Any questions, anyone from online? How to change the server? Farooq, in the coming classes, we will discuss how to change the server. For time being, remember that we can change from one server to another server. What is the difference between service, component, repository? I have not explained that yet. I will explain that. Can we add two servers? No, we need to add only one server. At a time, our application should be deployed in the one embedded server, not two embedded servers. What is the dependency management tag? Dependency management tag is used to configure the repositories like snapshot repository, remote repository, Nexus repository details we are going to specify. Difference between Maven and Gradle. When you attend the Gradle class, you will understand. Gradle I have not explained yet. I already conducted one workshop for the Gradle. I don't know how many you people attended. Right. Maven Gradle differences we'll understand in the Gradle classes. Dependency management tag to configure the repository servers. Difference between service component repository I have not covered as of now. And the banner Spring Boot. Mohit, what is the banner in the Spring Boot? That is not yet covered. These all are future topics, man. Do you have any questions on the today's topic? Ask any questions which are discussed in today's session, not future. How auto configuration will work internally. Tomorrow you will understand the run method. When you understand the run method, then you will understand how auto configuration working internally. Okay. Right. Perfect. Any other questions anyone want to ask? Online people, unmute your mic and speak out.
Sir, in Spring Boot project, there are so many different files available. There is a help.cd file, MU and CD.
Those are Maven configuration files, sir. These are MV and W, CMD. These are called as Maven wrappers. Okay. So that is nothing related with the Spring Boot. Those are Maven wrappers.
Okay. And if you execute this project, if you execute this project, they have so many options available for the run this project. That is the Spring Boot, Maven. What is the use of this?
Project is a Maven project. You can run this as a Maven build. You can run as a Java application because it is having a main method. You can run as a boot application also. Anyone you can use. Maven project, Maven goals you can execute. Okay. So currently we are using this option. Then the project is running as a Spring Boot application. So Spring Boot application execution will start from start class. Tomorrow you will understand what is this start class.
Hello, sir. Hello, sir.
Yeah, hi, Nishant.
Sir, what is the difference? What is the disadvantage of this Spring Boot? Because I see lots of dependencies are automatically downloaded.
Right.
So it may be temper the performance, I guess.
Whatever the dependencies you want with the Poms starter, it is downloading. If you don't want any dependency, you can exclude. In the Maven, dependency exclusion concept is available. In the Maven classes, I already covered how to exclude the dependency. Okay. So yes, it is simplifying your configuration. Whenever we add the web starter, all the required dependencies it is downloading to develop your web application. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yep.
So what is the difference between WAR and JAR, sir?
JAR means standalone project, WAR means web application. For the Spring Boot, JAR WAR doesn't make any difference because Spring Boot application will execute from the main method. Any application which will execute from the main, guys listen, any application which will execute from the main method that can be packaged as a JAR file. Okay. Spring Boot, all types of applications will execute from the main method. That's why the packaging format will be JAR for the Spring Boot. Normally, if you develop servlet application, that will be packaged as a WAR file. Okay. Yes.
Sir, can we develop the Android apps through Spring Boot framework?
No, sir. No.
Only web apps.
Yeah, web applications, standalone, and web services also.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sir?
Yeah.
I'm practicing in Lombok, but I'm adding Lombok dependency, and as well as I'm run the Lombok jar file also, but it's not getting setter methods and
yeah, we will check. For now, use the setters getters. I will check that issue. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, sir. Sir,
yes, tell me.
Actually, I changed the JRE in JDK 1.8, but it's Maven updating force. It automatically jumped to
yes, sir. Whenever you change the JRE, when you do the force up, whenever you do the Maven update, will come back to 1.5. Again, we need to change that path. In the build path, we need to change that.
Okay.
That is a bug in the Maven. We can't do anything for that.
Okay, sir.
Yeah, or else you can configure Java version in the Maven directly. Properties tag we can use java.version. Which version of Java you want to use in your project?
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Fine, guys. Good. Thank you. With this, I'm stopping for today. We'll meet in the tomorrow session, guys. Fine. Please practice creating the boot application. Whatever the examples we have done in the Spring, same examples you need to practice in the Spring Boot.